that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn Mr Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The issue of the BBC Charter review is something that has been awaited for some considerable time. I want to start the adjournment debate by quoting what has been quoted on many occasions about the BBC, and which is the mission of the BBC. It is to act in the public interest, serving all audiences through the provision of impartial, high quality and distinctive output and services which inform, educate and entertain. And as someone said in a different context many years ago, that would be a very good idea. Yes, it was.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I will not try to detain you too long. The honourable member and my friend is aware that many of our constituents who are put off by BBC bias, but who, for example, watch the Parliament channel, probably watching it right now as a matter of fact, are simply astounded that they will now pay £174.50 for the privilege, and this is the words of my constituent, and I quote him, and quote her as well, watching biased news reporting and social justice tracking programmes when all they really want to do is just to hear the news and watch a programme on farming. BBC, what are they?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and I think, given that he's a master of both interventions, taking them and giving them when he's on his feet, I agree with his comment. There was a statement from the previous government in April, just 6-7 months ago, and it was to explain the Charter, to take stock at the Charter's halfway point and evaluate the effectiveness of the BBC's governance and regulation, end of quote. They then went on, the role of public service broadcasting and a free press has never been more significant than it is today. We are all living in an era of fake news, they were certainly right there, where social media creates echo chambers of opinion, presents individual experience as established fact, and mis- and disinformation all go unchallenged, end of quote. So this sets the context for the mid-term review, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want then to move on to the comments made by the Director General of the BBC, who has repeatedly said that he wants to see greater accountability from the BBC. And I agree with him, and I agree with the BBC being more accountable. And hopefully the Charter in its new manifestation will explain that and expand upon that. For example, we have had over a number of years now what they call the on-screen talent, in inverted commas, and they have only recently had to have their BBC salaries declared publicly. And that was something I and others campaigned for many years. And many people said it would never be done, but thankfully it was done. And now we see, year on year, the top presenters all having their BBC salaries declared. And so it should be, because we, the public, pay for those salaries. We ought to know what they are. But here's another point that the Charter Review should take account of. There are a small number of those presenters who do have their BBC salaries declared. But some of them have private companies who then get commissioned programmes that appear on the BBC. And we are not allowed to know what the proceeds are of those commissioned programmes. So it could be the case that some on-screen talent gets, for example, £300,000 or even over £400,000 a year, paid for directly by the BBC for their appearances on the BBC. But in addition to that, because they have a private company or more that gets commissioned programmes, they then get additional sums of money, and we don't know whether that is a substantial 5-figure sum or even a substantial 6-figure sum. The Director General says he wants to see greater accountability. We want to see it in that. Hopefully the Charter Review will be able to address that.
Member, allow me?
Yes, sir.
Very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. The honourable friend mentions information that should be shared and accountability. What about transparency in the commissioning process? He's raised this on a number of occasions over the last number of years. Is he satisfied that there is transparency around the commissioning process? Is there opportunity and fairness for others within the commissioning process, or is there a greater opportunity through this charter review to inject transparency?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he's absolutely correct. There is a lack of transparency, and because I and others have raised this issue of BBC presenters who do their BBC work, and then when they know what the BBC are looking for in terms of programmes, have an inside track, as it were, because they have a private company that they can place and put in a position to be advantageously placed to get a contract. And the BBC have been very, very dilatory in terms of opening up about what that means and how that is reviewed and how is it made accountable. And there is a very significant degree of transparency. Now, on the issue of the BBC using licence payers' money in an accountable and transparent way, we've had a very recent example just last month, because we had a general election in the Irish Republic, and I understand, of course, there would be a read across to the impact that Northern Ireland would have on the outcome of that general election in the Republic. But the BBC in Northern Ireland already have 2 full-time reporters based in Dublin who one would assume were well placed to cover the Irish general election over that 3-week period. But in addition to those 2 full-time based Republic of Ireland reporters for the BBC, they dispatched the BBC Northern Ireland political editor from Belfast, the BBC correspondent from Belfast, a reporter for BBC Newsline in Belfast, and a senior journalist from BBC Radio 4. All were dispatched to Dublin, in addition to the 2 personnel that they already had in Dublin, all to cover the general election in the Irish Republic. And we are not allowed to know what the cost was of that coverage for the Irish Republic. So hopefully the Charter Review could look at that in terms of expenditure accountability. The other issue I wanted to raise, Madam Deputy Speaker, was the recent phenomenon which is known as BBC Verify. The BBC Verify has been described by Danny Cohen, a former director of BBC Television. He says, I quote, BBC Verify claims to represent a new gold standard in BBC reporting, but the frequency with which it has had to correct stories does not suggest that it is meeting these lofty aims, unquote. If that's a former director of BBC Television describing something that is only a very recent phenomenon and was supposedly set up to establish the BBC as the overseer of the verification of other news outlets, and he's saying it doesn't really live up to its description, then something has to be done to ensure that that would be the case, and that if there's going to be a verification, that it would be something that would stand close scrutiny. I would hope that the Minister, and I thank her for being in her place, I would hope that she would take the opportunity to respond. I fully understand the BBC in terms of its output and its day-to-day transmission is a separate body over which no one in Parliament should have any say, and we accept that that is the case. But in terms of the accountability, the transparency, and the lack of impartiality that there is often displayed in BBC output, these things must come into the review of the Charter, and hopefully we can hear something productive from the mid-term review, and I look forward to the Minister's response. Thank you.
Minister Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to respond to this debate, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for East Londonderry on securing it. The debate is a good opportunity to discuss the upcoming Charter Review, which we intend to launch next year. The Honourable Member has raised a number of important areas related to the BBC, which I will respond to, but I would first like to make a few broad points about the contribution the BBC makes to the UK. So the BBC supports our democracy, brings our communities together and helps to shape and define our nation through telling stories about the lives of people in all parts of the UK. It also plays an important role in providing trusted news as the UK's most trusted news brand, reaching around 95% of UK adults each month. It's one of Britain's biggest cultural exports and an important soft power asset, with BBC World Service providing essential, trustworthy news through 42 language services to millions of people across the globe, a topic I was pleased to discuss today while giving evidence to the joint DCMS Foreign Affairs and International Development Select Committees, and indeed I see one of the members in the chamber right now. The BBC has provided some of our most memorable moments across television, representing stories from every part of the UK. It acts as a linchpin to the UK's flourishing creative economy, investing in skills, training and creativity that drives growth across all regions of the UK. And last year it contributed £4.9 billion to the UK economy and supported over 50,000 jobs, with more than half of this impact outside London. And it invests more in original British content than anyone else. But moving on now to some of the points the Honourable Member has raised. So I note the member's views specifically on increasing accountability of the BBC as part of the Charter Review, and it is important that we get this area right. Charter Review will explore BBC accountability, particularly in terms of ensuring the BBC is accountable to those who fund it, the British people. As a public service broadcaster, which is hugely important to public life, the BBC must be responsive to its audience. The BBC has a duty to deliver impartial and accurate news coverage and content under the Charter, which specifically sets out that the BBC must observe high standards of openness and seek to maximise transparency and accountability. Now, since 2017, Ofcom have regulated the BBC and have taken action to make sure it is held to account. Ofcom is required to prepare and publish an operating framework for the BBC, which must contain provisions to secure the effective regulation of the activities of the BBC. Under the BBC's new operating licence introduced last year, the BBC is now required to report more comprehensively on its performance and plans for services. The Government welcomes Ofcom's recent report into the BBC's performance in 23-24. It notes its findings, including where Ofcom identified areas of improvement for the BBC. It is for Ofcom, as the BBC's independent regulator, to monitor the BBC's progress in these areas. The Charter also includes provision for the National Audit Office to examine the economy, efficiency and effectiveness with which the BBC uses its resources in discharging its functions. Now, the Honourable Member spoke about the issue of commissioning. A key principle of the BBC's success is its editorial and operational independence, which must be upheld, and that is why decisions around commissioning and programming are for the BBC board and not for the government. However, the BBC, while being operationally and editorially independent from government, BBC commissioning is rightly a matter for the BBC and not the government. It's not within the scope of the government to intervene in day-to-day commissioning decisions, but the Charter requires the BBC to open up content production to allow non-BBC producers to compete for BBC projects. By the end of this Charter, 2027, 100% of BBC television and 60% of BBC radio will be fully open to competition to support a diverse range of stories and views on the BBC. Ofcom, I will give way, yeah.
I thank very much the Minister for giving way. When she talks about the BBC needing to open up to other non-BBC personnel to bid for contracts, will she accept that that needs to be seen to be done on an equitable and fair basis so that people beyond the reach of the BBC have an equal opportunity to bid for contracts as well as internals?
Minister.
Yeah, I do accept that, and I think that is something we can look at as part of the Charter Review. But of course, Ofcom, as the BBC's independent regulator, holds the BBC to account on its performance, on its commissioning practices and the market impact of that. Moving on, he raised the issue of BBC pay, and I appreciate this can be a matter of debate and controversy. The Royal Charter requires the BBC, as he rightly pointed out in his speech, to publish the salary details of all BBC staff and talent paid over £178,000. Salary disclosures of this kind were, as he pointed out, made for the first time as part of the 16-17 annual report. The salaries of the BBC staff are also a matter for the BBC and the individuals themselves, not for government. But what I would say is Charter will look again at the transparency around it on that issue. I will.
Minister, my intervention on the Honourable Member for East Londonderry, I referred to impartiality, BBC bias. Many of my constituents feel that there's a BBC bias. They feel it's not impartial. Under the Charter, is it possible for those people who have concerns over that to express them in a way, and for those concerns to be investigated?
Well, of course, and right now there is a complaints procedure, of course. You've got BBC First, it can then be escalated, and of course his constituents can then, if they're not happy, go to Ofcom. But as part of the Charter review, it's absolutely right that all members of the public, if they want to, can have their say, and we will, as I'm going to go on to outline, be launching a public consultation so that his constituents and indeed people across the country can have their say, because we want the BBC to represent those that it serves. So moving on, I'm going to outline some of the points around the Charter Review. So next year, the Government will launch Charter Review with the aim of addressing some of the challenges that we're discussing today and delivering a renewed Charter by the end of 2027 that will support the BBC not just to survive but to thrive long into the future. This will be the 9th Charter Review in the BBC's history. It will be an opportunity to consider what the BBC is for, how it delivers for audiences, and how it should be funded, governed and regulated against a rapidly changing media environment. Charter Review will also look to uphold the BBC's independence and ensure that it maintains the trust of the public. Charter Review is a well-established process, and our next step in the process will be to publish a Terms of Reference next year, setting out the objectives that we wish to achieve through the Charter Review. We will ensure that we take all relevant views into account as part of the review, and with this in mind, next summer we will also launch a public consultation. We encourage everyone to share evidence as part of this. We need to have a truly national conversation and make sure the BBC is reflective of the people it serves, wherever they come from and whatever their background. And once we have consulted widely, considered the views of stakeholders and assessed the evidence, we will outline our policy direction for the next BBC Charter in a white paper in 2026. There will also be an opportunity to debate a draft charter before both houses before the current charter expires in 2027. The devolved governments will also be a key part to this conversation, and I look forward to visiting Northern Ireland in the coming months. I've already met with the Northern Ireland Minister for Communities online, and I welcome further conversations with my devolved counterparts. As we address vital issues about the future of the BBC, we must also ensure that there is a sustainable funding model that is fair for those who pay it, and this is an area we will consider as part of the upcoming Charter Review. The media landscape has changed radically since the current Charter was introduced in 2017, and the BBC faces key challenges to its sustainability. We can't ignore the fact that these challenges to the funding model in its current form are increasing, and we're fully committed to retaining the licence fee for the rest of this Charter period. However, for the BBC to succeed, it must have a sustainable funding to allow it to adapt and thrive in a changing media landscape. We are clear that what the BBC does and what it can achieve is inextricably tied to how it is funded, and these issues should be considered together. The Charter Review will be an important part of making sure the BBC is supported to do this. The Government is keeping an open mind about the best solutions, and as my department's work progresses, we will be working closely with the BBC and engaging with other broadcasters, stakeholders across the creative industries and of course the British public to inform our thinking. Now, while audience trends are changing, there are still millions of households that continue to rely on digital terrestrial television, also known as Freeview, and I'm glad to say that the continuity of the technology has been secured in legislation until at least 2034. The need to maintain traditional broadcasting platforms at the same time as there is a shift to online viewing is resulting in more choice for audiences, but it is of course creating financial pressures for our broadcasters, including the BBC. Our project on the future of TV distribution will explore these issues. We will analyse how people receive their television now and through the next decade. It will help us to ensure the continuity of a sustainable TV ecosystem and the best outcome for audiences. And as part of this project, I am glad to be chairing a new stakeholder forum on the future of TV distribution, which is allowing me to hear from TV stakeholders, including the BBC, infrastructure providers and groups that represent the interests of audiences. I will of course raise the issue of TV distribution when I next meet with my counterparts in the devolved governments. The Charter Review provides us with an exciting opportunity to engage the widest possible range of voices on the future of the BBC. The Government is committed to having a truly national conversation as part of Charter Review. It will be an honest, supportive and respectful debate that can give the public confidence in their BBC. We will provide more details on what this looks like and how stakeholders can contribute their views in due course when we launch the review next year. But the Honourable Member for East Londonderry has contributed to that national conversation today, and for that I thank him.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. And many of that opinion say aye. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.